I think most importantly is having meaningful work and meaningful relationships together, where you're on a passion, a mission to create something great, excellent.
Are you concerned, though, about America's position on the world stage because of all the actions we're taking due to the tariffs?
Well, as I said, there were five major forces,
yeah.
and maybe I'll just take a minute to try to explain those, okay? Throughout history, there are these big cycles. Debt rises relative to incomes that you can't, until it can't anymore, and so on, and then you have the adjustment. Well, in addition to that, in addition to the debt money thing that we're talking about, there is the internal order and disorder cycle that has to do with the left-right conflicts that happen. Mm-hmm. And so we are now in a period of time where there's been, I would say, a deterioration in our country in a lot of different ways, and that there are strong views from either side, and there's a conflict, you need a more autocratic approach in order to take charge of that. And so we're now having the system, the democracy, in a different way than we've said. We have a conflict between the left and the right because even people believe that everything's politicized. Mm-hmm. They look at the Supreme Court and they say, can I get an honest judgment? But it is politicized. And for those reasons, as we've seen in the past, very similar to the 30s, we're seeing this very similar to the 30s, we have that internal conflict, okay? In addition, we have a geopolitical conflict. We see this, the rise of a great power challenging a great power that is more declining. We have been, in a sense, by a lot of measures, certainly on a relative basis, declining. And that great power conflict we see, as we've seen just recently, such a good example of the parade in Beijing with President Xi,
right.
Putin and Modi, and plus a number of other leaders. So we have this geopolitical conflict, which is a costly endeavor. Just if we take the economics, the cost of military, and then the cost of trade wars and other things are very costly economically, but they need to be dealt with. So that's the third force. The fourth force is, throughout history, acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars and have toppled more orders than anything else. And of course, number 5 force is man's inventiveness, particularly of new technology.
Yeah.
Right? So we're seeing the interaction. So you're touching on that when you're asking the question. Definitely, there have been great disruptions, and there's great questions of what the new world order will look like. And there is, like there was in the 30s, Axis powers and allied powers. There is a polarization that we're seeing, and approaching greater amounts of conflict. So geopolitically, we're in a trade war. We are in a technology war. We are in a capital war. We are in a geopolitical influence war. And that, of course, is very relevant to the whole picture. That will make less efficiencies, but it needs to also create self-sufficiencies, because one, in this warlike environment, cannot depend on getting things from others.
Right.
Think of it this way, that the credit system, the capital market system, is like the circulatory system that brings credit to the various parts of the body, and those are buying power that are like nutrients. But it also produces debt. Now, if it produces income that is better than the debt, bigger than the debt, so it can service it, it's a healthy process. But what happens is that if you raise debt and debt service payments relative to incomes, it squeezes out, like plaque in the circulatory system, squeezes out other spending because you have to spend so much money on the debt service.
Right.
Okay. And so you can see that developing. And if that continues for a while, then you have a debt heart attack, essentially, okay? Also, that there's a certain supply of debt that has to be sold, and there's a certain demand for that debt.
Right.
So, and one man's debts are another man's assets. So they have to provide a high enough return to keep the creditor happy. Now, what happens is not only as that debt squeeze happens, which we are seeing clearly in the government, we're seeing that, we'll go over that in a second, but you're seeing that squeeze happening. We're also seeing an enormous amount of supply. So what's happening now, just to put it in perspective, is the government is spending about $7 trillion a year, and it's taking in about $5 trillion a year.
So there's a $2 trillion discrepancy.
Deficit. So it's spending, think of it like a family, okay, or a business. It's spending 40% more than it is taking in. And it's been doing that for many years, and as a result, it has a debt that is 6 times, 600% of its income. So that is a squeeze that's developing. And so as we, there's a lot of other things behind that, but you can see that mechanics. And this is a situation really that you're at the point where both the government, federal, will have that deficit to fund, and then the central bank comes in and buys. So we see a lot of pressure on the central bank to ease monetary policy, to bring those interest rates down and so on. And that has can have a problem if it makes the bonds no longer attractive.
What reforms do you believe are effective and politically realistic to avoid this outcome?
The two may be mutually exclusive and politically realistic. So I've spent time with leaders of both parties in Washington, and most people, and I think they all agree on what I've just said about the debt problems. And I think we're at a point, looking at the numbers like a doctor, we're at the point where what could happen, theoretically, what could happen is what I call the 3% three-part solution, which means bring the deficit down to 3% of GDP. And you have to do it in 3 parts because there are 3 things that affect the deficit. That is spending. That is taxes. Tax revenue. And also interest rates. And if you cut, you have to do it by a bit of all. And so if you cut about 4% in spending, and you raise taxes the equivalent of about 4%, that would improve the supply and the demand picture, and it would allow interest rates to naturally to decline, and that would get you to about a stable situation, stabilizing where it is now. If you don't do that, then next year we're going to accumulate a lot more because
debt.
We're going to accumulate another $2 trillion over the next 10 years. We'll accumulate about $25 trillion. Okay, so debt service payments will go through the roof, and that'll mean that we need to actually borrow money. The government needs to borrow money. Central bank needs to borrow money in order to pay the debt. And as that, you get that compounded effect. That's near the end of the debt cycle where bad things happen.
So how should investors be thinking about reallocating their portfolio amidst all of these 5 factors at play and the current geopolitical macroeconomic?
Well, I think the most important thing they have to understand is how to diversify their okay, because markets, if you have a bad market, if you have bad economy, bonds go up and stocks go down and so on. So you can create a balanced portfolio. I don't want to digress into that too much because that would take too much time. But I also have to encourage them to think about the nature of the problem that we have and a question of how their portfolio is diversified for the value of money. We're in a situation now where money is debt and debt is money. What I mean by that is if you have money, you're storing it in the form of a debt instrument. And a debt instrument is a promise from somebody to give you money. And when we have too much debt and the supply demand that we're talking about, there's a high likelihood of the devaluation of money. And that's not just American money, that is most money, because countries are in similar positions and they don't want to get uncompetitive by having uncompetitive exchange rates. So such periods of that, such as the 70s, the 1970s, or the 1930s, are periods in which one has to worry about the value of money. That's why gold is going up so much.
Right. What are some of your leadership tactics or guidance or principles that you think really helped you build Bridgewater into the success and your investment career as one of the world's most successful investors?
I think most importantly is having meaningful work and meaningful relationships together, where you're on a passion, a mission to create something great, excellent, and you have meaningful relationships, that they're in it together, you're sharing each other's lives, that this is more than, it's a mission, more than just an accomplishment. And then you have to, everything is people and culture. You have to get the people right, and the people right means you have to get people of great character and great capabilities. And you have to enable them. It's like orchestrating an orchestra. You're the conductor, but who your community is and how they work together is everything. And I believe that has to be done like running a great team. Bill Belichick, when he read my book, Principles, and said, your work principles, he gave me a call and he said, I want to meet and talk about the principles because yours are the same as mine. Oh, that was very interesting. And that means that you have to find the stars, you have to nurture them, and then you also have to select them and keep stars. As Steve Jobs said, if you don't keep all A players, the A players will have the B players. Pretty soon you'll have the C players, and the A players won't want to be there. So I believe that you have to have radical truthfulness in dealing with these issues. I'm not here to provide investment advice.
Right, of course.
But I do want to say that diversification and thinking about the value of money, what is a storehold of money, this is going to be a very important theme as we think, what is money? What is money as a medium of exchange, but it has to be a storehold of wealth. And we have a problem regarding that. And so as we have Bitcoin coming and other things out there.
Right, I was going to follow up with Bitcoin. You suggested at a smaller level, there should be potentially a little bit of exposure to that?
Well, yeah, I do. There's pros and cons, but what you think about Bitcoin and what you think about gold. It's not going to be a central bank, I don't believe, a central bank asset, whereas gold is now the third largest reserve currency. Dollar, euro, then gold, and it's being accumulated. Also, it's a currency that is easy to track and can be controlled, and there are other issues. Bitcoin is, I mean. So I prefer gold for him. But the question still is, in the future, what will be money and the storehold of wealth? And that's something to be considered when thinking about how to diversify a portfolio. Because you want your portfolio always to have real returns. In other words, don't look at nominal returns, just what the return is, but what it is relative to inflation.